U.S. citizens have a very unique situation in that they have, no matter where in the world they live, certain obligations to report and pay tax on their income, no matter where it comes from, even if they no longer live in the United States. Now today I'm going to again dispel some of the most common myths about why Americans can't move overseas, because they most certainly can, and they most certainly can reduce their taxes. But I'm also going to go through 6 particular issues that you need to be aware of when you're doing that. So if you're a U.S. citizen and you've ever looked at living overseas, you've probably seen articles in the mainstream media that talk about how the U.S. is basically one of 2 countries in the world that has what's called citizenship-based taxation. Most countries in the world tax people on a residential basis on their worldwide income. So if you live in that country and you meet the criteria of being a tax resident, which is generally defined as you spend too much time there, or your center of life is there, your kids go to school, like the whole picture comes into play basically. But you know, if you live there full time and that's where you work and that's where your money is, you pay tax there. If, however, you're Irish or you're British or you're German or you're Austrian and you want to move to Dubai or the Cayman Islands or Vanuatu, you can go through a process of cutting your ties. It's not as easy as people think, but there is a process of cutting your ties with the country. You get to keep your citizenship and you can maintain no tax obligations to them. You just basically leave, and if you ever want to come back, you can start paying taxes again in the future. The U.S. is different, and I'm going to dispel some of the most common myths that Americans think they can't move overseas and reduce their taxes, but also talk about some of the challenges and how you can face those. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. I'm a former American, and here in our business, we help 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors, both from the US and from all around the world, who want to legally reduce their taxes overseas, who want to diversify and protect their assets, and who want to increase their freedom with multiple second passports, and other global strategies. We also host an annual conference called Nomad Capitalist Live. It's open to absolutely everybody, and you can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. So let me go over again the fact that if you are a U.S. citizen, yes, you have extra obligations. Yes, there are regulations on how you run your business overseas. There are certain reporting that you need to do to the IRS. You need to follow U.S. accounting principles, which may impact certain deductions you might take overseas in an offshore company, things like that. However, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a freelancer, whether you have even a job, you can legally reduce, if not eliminate, the taxes that you owe the United States. There's a couple of different ways to do that. Now, you can live in another country and you can pay taxes there, and potentially there may be a treaty or a credit or some way to reduce your tax obligations in the United States or totally eliminate them. That means that you're paying tax somewhere else, and so you're not necessarily saving money. But if you want to go and live in France, for example, or Canada or something like that, it's not always going to be perfect. A lot of Canadians complain that certain, investments they have don't line up, the tax systems don't match up, and so you might end up having some challenges. But you're not necessarily going to be double taxed simply because you decided to move to London or Paris or what have you. However, you can also, for example, if you're an entrepreneur, the people we talk to, you can move to another country. You can incorporate your business offshore. There are certain criteria that Americans need to follow when their businesses are offshore, which are more strict than what anyone else would have to follow, but you can do that. It's not that difficult. And you can take, for example, the foreign earned income exclusion. You can enjoy certain deferral. And so I'm giving you kind of a simplistic overview, but you can legally reduce your taxes, if not to zero as an entrepreneur, certainly probably to the single digits. Or into the low double digits, but whatever number is going to be, because this is not tax advice, you are able to reduce your taxes substantially versus if you lived in the United States. And you can do that by either living in one country overseas that's tax friendly, or you can live a nomadic lifestyle. And in that regard, the U.S. is actually easier than many other Western countries in that under certain conditions, they don't really care where you're at. There are certain tax exclusions where they're more concerned where you are and how much time you're spending there. There are others where it's just like, hey, as long as you're not here, we don't really care. And that is more liberal than some other Western countries. Now, so the bottom line is, you're an American. Don't fall for this trap. Well, they tax you no matter where you go, so you can't save anything. You might as well stay here. No, you might not. If you want to go overseas and save, or if you just want to go overseas for a better lifestyle, and you say, well, if I'm going overseas, why should I pay? Don't worry, you can do that. You need to do some planning, but you can do that. Now, there was an article in Forbes recently by Kathleen Petticord, who talked about other unique impacts of being an American abroad. And there's 6 particular challenges that she mentions in the article in Forbes that I want to comment on. Other unique aspects of being a U.S. citizen, and why some people have decided to overcome all these issues and just simply renounce their U.S. citizenship, which means you need a second passport first. The first issue was Americans abroad must file taxes in the United States and in the country where they are tax resident. In some cases, they may have to pay tax twice. That's true, however, that really shouldn't be the case. And unless you're really dead set on a certain place where that would be the case, you can either move to a tax-friendly country, you can move to a treaty jurisdiction. There's many different strategies that you can use to not have to pay tax twice. And do you need to pay taxes where you're a tax resident? So the issue is, in my German example, you are a German tax resident because most people, right, you're a German citizen, you live in Germany, you're born in Germany, you go to school in Germany, bank in Germany, have a job in Germany, business in Germany, everything's in Germany, right? If one day you're like, wait a second, why does everything have to be in Germany? And you're like, I'm clearing out and I'm going to Dubai, then you can go through the process of not being a German tax resident. Now, what many Western countries would like to know is, where are you going to be a tax resident? That's increasingly a thing, and there are numerous strategies. If you just want to be a nomad, there are certain ways you can handle that and say, all right, I'm going to pay a little bit of tax over here, maybe a nominal amount, and that's my tax home, and so, all right, that may satisfy my home country that I'm at least paying somewhere, even though I'm living in different places. What a lot of people will also do is if they just want to live in one place at least the majority of the year, they'll go to Dubai and they'll become a tax resident by virtue of spending time there, for example. So if you spend more than half the year in the UAE, you'll be a UAE tax resident. And again, not giving you tax advice, but that can often satisfy wherever it is that you're coming from. And so, hey, you're not a German tax resident. Oh, okay, you're living in Dubai and you're paying tax in the UAE, which just so happens to be zero. Cool, as long as you're paying someone. Now, not every country does that. There are plenty of countries that just don't really care, but Western countries are increasingly becoming difficult. However, as an American, you are a U.S. tax resident. That is what follows you just by virtue of having the citizenship. You can't get rid of it unless you renounce your citizenship. Moving to Puerto Rico does offer you certain advantages to get down to a zero or single-digit tax rate, but you still carry all the other obligations of being a U.S. citizen. If you have, for example, bank accounts overseas, Puerto Rico does not get rid of that. However, the bottom line is, even if you're a U.S. taxpayer, you don't necessarily need to be tax resident anywhere else because you have the U.S. tax residence. If you want to move somewhere else and you want to pay taxes there, that's fine. However, many Americans decide, listen, I'm going to live Andrew Henderson's trifecta model. I'm going to live 4 months in different places that aren't going to tax me. And if there ever became an issue, potentially, again, not tax advice, the U.S. could save you from having to pay tax somewhere else because, again, you're paying the U.S., even if it's only a couple percentage points on a small business, but you can change that. So the question that every American needs to ask themselves is, do I want to live in one place a majority of the time? Or do I want to live in different places or just kind of be totally nomadic? And either one works, but there's different strategies for both. And so the idea that you're going to have to pay taxes somewhere else as an American isn't really necessarily true. All right, the second issue. Foreign bank accounts must be reported to the U.S. Department of the Treasury via an FBAR, which is a report you file online if you have accounts overseas which have $10,000 or more. People think, oh, I'll just have like $9,000 in a couple different accounts. No, it's add them up, stack them up, $10,000 or more. And there's, by the way, there's a currency exchange rate. If your money is in some other currency, you can figure out what the US dollar equivalent is. They actually publish that. And so if you have 10 grand or more, in all the accounts together, you have to report. By the way, even if it's just for like a moment in time, you need to report. And this is a common thing that people who've lived overseas for many years often don't understand. They hire some kind of domestic tax preparer, someone who handled their taxes before they moved overseas. And they're like, no, you're not an offshore guy. You're just living in London. If you have an account outside of the United States, and all the accounts you have together, could be sub-accounts, it could be like anything. It could be an account where you closed on a house and you took the money out, and anything, you've got to report that. And there's other financial accounts. You can report certain stuff. There's not entirely full guidance on every kind of foreign financial account, but it's also things like brokerage accounts. There's certain things where we'll talk to tax people and they'll be like, you know what? Yeah, you should probably report that, even though it's not like an actual bank account. So yeah, if you have money overseas, by the way, not the end of the world. You certainly need to keep track of it. I have a bunch of accounts overseas, and yeah, every year it was like, all right, let me make sure what was the highest balance, and okay, convert that from that currency to the. I mean, it was work, no doubt, but I can't say that it was not worth it. And by the way, if you're more normal than I am, and you're not going to have umpteen different accounts, it'll be a lot easier for you. Point number 3, Americans abroad must spend time and money preparing a U.S. tax return with significant penalties, even criminal liability for errors. And yeah, that certainly looms large as someone who likes to be compliant, someone who's very conservative, someone who doesn't want to cause any problems, you have to make sure you're doing things properly. And if you have businesses and different business structures and different entities, and you're doing payroll overseas, you're like to have multiple bank accounts, and like you're traveling around and you're diversified, again, is it manageable? Sure. Can you outsource it? Largely. But it is something that weighs on you. The severity of the penalty, depending on whether it's willful or non-willful violation, and willfully failing, for example, to file an FBAR can incur, big penalties. Let's talk about the penalties. Problem number 4 is finding a U.S. accountant who is well-versed in international taxes is difficult. These types of accountants, if found, can often be expensive, charging about $1,000 per year. If I can only wish $1,000 per year. So sure, if you're the average expat, which is what this Forbes article that I'm quoting from was referring to, hey, yeah, it might cost you $1,000 just to do your taxes. And so if you're making 80 or 100 grand, that's a decent chunk that, again, a German or a Belgian or a South African wouldn't have to necessarily go through. And yes, it is hard to find U.S. tax accountants, especially once you get into the higher realms. This is why I've spent all these years traveling around meeting people, and we've seen who's good and we've seen who's not so good. And you see, hey, this guy knows how to prepare basic tax returns and FBARs, but the moment you get into multi-part offshore structures, they don't know what to do. It's a very small number of people who know what they're doing. A lot of people think they have a good tax preparer, good accountant, good strategist, and yet they're really very few and far between. Because most people don't really understand the intricacies of international tax, and so it is hard. The 5th issue, finding a foreign bank that will accept you as a client post-FATCA, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which is what the U.S. uses to enforce its system of you filing an FBAR, can involve extra legwork, more administrative hoops, etc. That's less of an issue, honestly. I mean, there's certain banks that just don't take Americans, so the options are lower, but whether you've got $1,000 or $1 million, there are banks that will take you. We've talked about that in other episodes. And by the way, you now have other reporting systems where other countries require information sharing. And so it's becoming more of an information sharing world where I just think people are banks are used to that. And so I think the correct thing is there are banks that won't accept Americans, even if you're living overseas. We've seen a couple new banks where they will take Americans if you've been living overseas, sometimes for X years. And so that is opening up. But no doubt you have fewer options. There are still options, and I wouldn't let that one I wouldn't get hung up on that one, quite frankly. And number 6, if you successfully renounce citizenship, your name will be published in the Federal Register's quarterly list, affecting your privacy. So if you are a loudmouth such as myself making videos about it, then obviously I have given up my right to privacy in the matter. If you don't want people to know that you've renounced citizenship, then sure. If you don't want to deal with having to report your bank accounts, having to do all this complication, and you say, hey, can I just give up my citizenship? Let me get citizenship by investment. Maybe my grandfather was Irish and I can claim Irish citizenship. You can do that, but I know we have talked to some pretty successful business people who are like, my name is known, and if that got out there, maybe someone would write an article, and I don't really want that to be the case. So that is an issue. Some people do feel stuck, like they have to stay American, even though they might want to live overseas. So those are 6 unique challenges that Americans have. I think they can all be overcome, and I think you can all deal with them, especially if you're successful. You can outsource things. You do need to keep a watchful eye on everything because the penalties are high. And I have always said, as the goody two-shoes of the offshore world, you want to be compliant. If you don't like the system, well, you can renounce, you can exit stage left in the system, and they will respect that. But those are some challenges. Don't let that hold you back from being an American who goes overseas. Don't believe the narrative that the media puts out, because the media does not entirely understand the reality. You can still dramatically reduce taxes. You can still increase freedom. You can still diversify your wealth. And I think that's the right thing to do for folks who want to go where you're treated best. It's still doable.